Nestled on the windswept coast of England lies the quiet village of St. Anselm's, a place where time seems to stand still and secrets are buried beneath layers of history. Into this tranquil setting arrives Miss Jane Marple, the sharp-eyed and deceptively gentle spinster from St. Mary Mead, hoping for nothing more than a peaceful holiday among new acquaintances. Yet fate has a curious way of leading her toward mystery. At the heart of the tale is a silver locket, an heirloom said to be cursed, carrying with it a trail of misfortune that stretches back generations, passed down through the hands of the Whitcomb family. The locket is admired not only for its intricate craftsmanship, but also whispered about in hushed tones for the tragedies it has heralded. Where the locket appears, so too does misfortune, as though its cold silver frame binds the present to sins of the past. When an unexpected death unsettles the calm of the estate, suspicion falls upon every guest. Old rivalries, hidden romances, and long-forgotten scandals come to light, weaving a web of deceit that only Miss Marple's penetrating insight can untangle. With her keen understanding of human nature, she begins to peel back the layers of polite society, finding truth where others see only coincidence. Miss Marple and Enigma of the Silver Locket is a tale of suspense and subtle observation, where every glance, every word, and every silence may conceal a clue. In the hands of Miss Marple, even the darkest mystery must eventually yield to the light. Chapter 1. The arrival at St. Anselm's coast announced itself long before Miss Marple saw the sea. Salt rode inland on the breeze, turning hedgerows to powdery green and laying a faint film upon the railway carriage window. She wiped a small circle clear with the corner of her handkerchief and peered out at the slow undulation, a field stitched with stone walls. The train gave a final protesting sigh as it pulled into St. Anselm's halt, a modest platform with a painted bench, a notice about tides, and a signal box that looked too shy to admit it was useful. Miss Marple descended carefully, gathering her carpet-bag and parasol. There was no bustle. St. Anselm's, like certain old gentlemen, did nothing in haste. A single porter materialized, took her bag as though it were a friend he'd always intended to meet, and led her along the platform. Overhead gulls circled with an air of proprietary interest. "Going up to Whitcomb Hall, are you, madam?" the porter asked, glancing at the card pinned to her trunk. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I am to stay at Miss Hargrave's boarding house, but I am invited to dine at the Hall this evening." The porter's eyebrow performed a slight, separate dance. "Very nice. The Whitcombs are having quite a week of it. Visitors upon visitors." He said it with the neutral relish of one who collected local facts like stamps. Miss Marple smiled. "Visitors bring anecdotes, and anecdotes bring tea. I have never known them to be entirely dangerous." The porter chuckled, surrendering the bag to a boy with a wheelbarrow. "No indeed, though folk here say the sea tells the truth sooner or later. She grind a secret down till it shines." Miss Marple thought this a rather poetic notion for a man in a cap, but then life had often shown her that poetry slipped out everywhere, like sand. She took a taxi along a lane lined with tamarisk and thrift, past fishermen's cottages with nets hung to dry, and a church whose squat tower stared down the Atlantic like a wary vicar. Miss Hargrave, proprietor of Seaview House, which offered only a reluctant glimpse of water, if one leaned dangerously from the top landing, greeted her newest resident with an embrace that grazed propriety but did not wound it. She was spare and upright, her hair rolled into a bun so emphatic it might have been a moral statement. "Welcome to St. Anselm's, Miss Marple. I do so love meeting ladies with sense in their hats. Tea now, or will you have time to rest? The Whitcombs dine at 7 quite grand, but the soup is usually tepid." "Tea would be a delight," said Miss Marple, "and perhaps directions to the hall for later." While Miss Hargrave rattled cups with the conscientious gaiety of a ship's steward, Miss Marple allowed her glance to wander the sitting-room. A framed sampler warned that idle hands invite mischief. A shell case served as an umbrella stand, and upon the mantel, a photograph showed a girl of 17 holding a tennis racket and looking as if the future were an afternoon she fully intended to win. Miss Hargrave's niece, perhaps. The house smelled of lavender polish and the faint, homely ghost of boiled cabbage. Over tea, Miss Hargrave proved a treasury of information delivered without malice and with the stoic accuracy of a barometer. "Whitcomb Hall," she said, lay a mile inland on a rise from which the family could pretend not to care for the sea while enjoying every advantage of its brisk. Sir Lionel Whitcomb, amiable, inattentive, and a veteran of committees, had managed to keep the estate from the worst indignities of modern bills. Lady Whitcomb, née Caroline Wraxall, possessed a backbone of such admirable steel that one might hang a family upon it, and perhaps she had. Their children were Evelyn sensibly pretty, some might say too sensible for prettiness to be a career, and Arthur, recently returned from the continent with theories about art and a mustache that looked provisional. Also in residence were Dr. Julius Hart, a family friend whose cheerful voice lived in the hall before him, Miss Cora Nash, a cousin of uncertain latitude, and Mr. Felix Vane, a charming man who appeared to know how to charm, knowing it was charm that was required, and a houseful of servants that behave as if they've been designed. "Not hired," concluded Miss Hargrave with a quirk of the mouth. "If I had their polish I would open a second house on the Esplanade, and what is the occasion for such a gathering?" asked Miss Marple lightly. Miss Hargrave's teaspoon paused against the saucer. "Ah, there is talk of an heirloom, an old trinket, newly rediscovered in a drawer. A locket, silver. The Whitcombes have not displayed it before. They are not a showy family, but Lady Whitcombe intends to settle certain doubts about provenance. Hush opinions in the village. You know, people rarely hush," remarked Miss Marple, "but they do tire." At 6:30, Miss Marple set out along the lane, her shawl drawn close against a breeze that fussed at hedges and the ends of one's resolve. The approach to Whitcombe Hall was courteous rather than grand. A sweep of gravel, a facade of honeyed stone touched by centuries of weather, and a porch with columns that seemed to apologize for existing at all. Lights pricked the windows within. She was admitted by a butler so discreet he might have been a roomer until he took one's hat with hands that had learned patience from Silver Dot in the drawing room. A small society arranged itself with the self-conscious ease of people who wish to appear unarranged. Lady Whitcombe advanced to greet Miss Marple with a warmth that wore discipline like perfume. "My dear Miss Marple, Caroline Whitcombe, Mrs. Bantry speaks volumes of you. We are honored." "You are kind," said Miss Marple, taking the measure of the room with the soft, uninsistent attention of a cat deciding where to sit. "I am quite content with a plate and a corner." Sir Lionel, pink and pleasant, beamed as though the evening were already a success. Evelyn Whitcombe shook hands with practical fingers. Arthur bowed with a flourish that did not reach his eyes. Dr. Hart boomed approval of everything, and Felix Vane said, enchanted in a tone carefully calibrated to sound unpracticed. Cousin Cora, narrow as a knitting needle, watched from near the fire with the expression of a person counting slips. Conversation flowed. It was about the usual things that sound singular in new rooms. The gale last Thursday that leaned on the cliff path, a new rector whose sermons, being short, were nearly popular, and a fishmonger who had learned to tell the truth without endangering commerce. Miss Marple said little. She liked to let talk pass her way as one lets a stream run around one's ankles to learn the temperature and the stones. Dinner arrived with correctness. That would have satisfied a bishop. The soup was indeed tepid, but the sole that followed was delicate, and the lamb honest. Miss Marple watched how people reached for salt, how they declined vegetables, when they laughed and when they looked toward Lady Whitcombe before laughing. She knew from long acquaintance that human nature writes its memorandum upon the most trivial paper. Only when the syllabub had retreated did Lady Whitcombe give the slightest signal. The drawing-room reordered itself, doors whispered, and the butler, bearing a small casket as if it held a sleeping idea, entered and placed it upon a table where the light fell obediently. The party drew near with the politeness of curiosity well bred. "The Whitcombe locket," said Lady Whitcombe, not grandly, but with the frankness of a woman tidying an old subject. "It belonged to Isabella Whitcombe, who married into misfortune in 1792 and out of it by widowhood in 1794. We had thought it lost. It was found unexpectedly in a locked compartment of a desk. Miss Marple, will you do us the favor?" The casket's hinges sighed. Inside, upon dark velvet, lay a silver locket of unusual delicacy, oval, its border engraved with something like hawthorn, and in the center a miniature keyhole that seemed less a mechanism than a question. Miss Marple's fingers, steady as always, did not touch. Objects acquired a sediment of meaning from the hands that held them. She preferred to observe until she had learned the current. "How very pretty," she said. "One marvels how thin a piece of metal can carry so much past upon its back." Arthur laughed. "Past is the only thing with any weight to it." He leaned very slightly forward, then checked himself, as if remembering a lesson about museums. "Some say it is unlucky," observed Cora Nash, her voice throwing pins. "Great and Isabella's locket, a trail of watery ends and fallen fortunes. If you collect tragedies like charms, the chain will grow heavy. Family stories grow teeth." Dr. Hart replied, jovial, "They bite their tellers. I never met an heirloom with a will of its own." "Most unpleasant things are given will by people who want to be frightened," said Lady Whitcombe calmly. "We intend only to have the locket stones assessed and its setting repaired." And then she paused. "Then it will do what it has always done, sit in a drawer and acquire dust." "An honorable occupation," murmured Miss Marple. Felix Vane studied the miniature keyhole. "Does it open?" "It did," said Evelyn. "Once there is no key." "A pity," said Mr. Vane, and his tone suggested that all locks pained him in principle. It was not, Miss Marple thought, the locket alone that animated the room. It was the locket as mirror. People angled themselves upon it, hoping to see a reflection that excused or affirmed. That is how treasure works in families. She had found less a thing possessed than a story rehearsed. The evening drew to its well-bred close. Miss Marple's shawl reclaimed and good nights distributed, allowed herself to be carried back to the lane upon the mild tide of the household's efficiency. Outside, the air had grown damp, and the moon had put a coin of light in every puddle. Somewhere inland, an owl added a thoughtful note to the ledger of sounds. As she walked, Miss Marple considered the subtle eddies at the hold-away. Evelyn's eyes rested a fraction too long on her brother when the locket was mentioned. The way Cora counted, always counting. The faint proprietary impatience in Mr. Vane's voice, and a quiet tension beneath Lady Whitcombe's poise. Like the taut string inside a violin, she had come to St. Anselm's for sea air and the moral advantages of idleness. Yet the sea, Miss Marple reflected, never truly idles. It wears at things until their shapes confess. She tightened her shawl and smiled to herself, not with anticipation, but in recognition. Human nature was abroad on the wind, and somewhere in a velvet-lined box, a small silver circle had begun to turn again, as such circles do, making alignments no one intends until they do. Chapter 2. The Silver Locket's legend morning in St. Anselm's was the kind that seemed older than the century. Mist clung to the hedgerows, and the bells of the small parish church drifted on the air like slow ripples. Miss Marple, neat as always, in her grey tweed coat, joined Miss Hargrave at breakfast where a boiled egg stood upright with military precision. The boarding-house dining-room hosted 2 other residents, a retired colonel who measured his porridge with the severity of a field map, and a young typist who seemed perpetually late to everywhere but breakfast. They provided a polite chorus of small remarks, but Miss Hargrave, with her talent for turning even the arrangement of butterpats into local history, soon carried the conversation. "You caused quite a stir last night at Whitcomb Hall, I gather," she said with evident relish. "The villagers can talk of nothing but the reappearance of that silver locket. Poor Mrs. True from the grocer's shop swears it's a bad omen. You'd think it were a thunderstorm rather than a trinket in a box." Miss Marple tilted her head, buttering her toast with deliberate gentleness. "Superstition travels faster than trains," she said, "and it is harder to delay." The colonel snorted. "Nonsense about curses, old wives' tales, steel, gunpowder, and common sense. That's what wins battles, not trinkets and charms." Yet even he lowered his voice when Miss Hargrave, her eyes alight, began to recount the legend of the Whitcomb locket. "The curse unfolds, it begins," she said, "with Isabella Whitcomb, a beauty in the Georgian era, who married Captain Roland Harcourt. He gave her the locket on their wedding day. A week later, he drowned at sea under circumstances suspicious enough that the coroner recorded foul play, suspected Isabella, swore never to remove the locket, and indeed she died 2 years later. Found in her chamber with the chain about her neck snapped clean." The typist gasped softly. "Since then," Miss Hargrave continued, "every generation that brought the locket into the open met with calamity. A riding accident here, a failed venture there, always some misfortune clinging close. It became custom to keep it locked away. Lady Whitcomb has been brave, I must say, to display it before guests." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Bravery often resembles necessity. I wonder what prompted Lady Whitcomb to court such risk." "That," said Miss Hargrave with a smile that hinted at relish, "is the question." Afternoon at the Hall. Later that day, Miss Marple accepted Evelyn Whitcomb's invitation to stroll through the Hall's gardens. The lawns rolled away like velvet carpets interrupted by disciplined hedges. Evelyn, a young woman whose clear gaze spoke of sensible thoughts, linked her arm through Miss Marple's with an intimacy that suggested relief. "You must think it silly of us, making such fuss over a locket," she said, "but truly, it unsettles everyone. Even Mother, though she would never admit it, looked uneasy." "Objects collect stories," Miss Marple observed, "and people collect fears. It is the way of families to hand down both, tied together with ribbon." Evelyn sighed. "Arthur, my brother, insists we should sell it. He says we cannot afford to indulge sentiment over superstition. Yet Cousin Cora believes it must remain in the family, as proof of our lineage. Felix Vainwell, he would admire a teaspoon if it glittered. And Dr. Hart laughs. But he laughs at everything. It falls to Mother, as always, to decide." They passed a fountain where water leaped as if it enjoyed being momentarily free before falling back into the basin. Miss Marple paused, considering the play of sunlight on droplets. "And what do you believe, my dear?" "I believe," Evelyn said slowly, "that the locket is dangerous, not because it is cursed, but because people want it to be. That is often worse." Whispered warnings at evening. The village inn buzzed with gossip. Men with pipes and women with knitting needles repeated the tale of the locket as though it were happening anew. Miss Marple, who had a knack for being both invisible and indispensable in such settings, listened quietly from her corner. "Mark my words," said old Mrs. Prowse, wagging her finger, "something ill will come of it. The Whitcombs never should have brought it out. Death follows that thing like a shadow." "Superstition," cried another. "It's naught but silver, and silver pays debts well enough." But beneath the chatter, Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of unease. Even those who scoffed crossed themselves or touched wood as they spoke. Fear, she noted, was contagious even among skeptics. Nightfall. Unease back at Seaview House. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly while the sea murmured in the distance. She replayed the day in her mind. Lady Whitcomb's calm insistence, Arthur's veiled impatience, Evelyn's honest worry, Cousin Cora's sharp eyes, Felix Vane's charm. Each had reacted to the locket as though it were more than silver, more than history. Outside, a shadow moved along the lane, lingering by the gate before slipping into darkness. Miss Marple, without alarm, noted the time on her small travel clock. Human curiosity, she thought, is far more dangerous than curses. Closing reflection as she folded her knitting away. Miss Marple considered the pattern of events. The Locket story was not merely a legend, it was a stage upon which the Whitcombs and their guests now played their parts. Fear would make some reckless, greed would make others bold, and love or loyalty might drive still others to folly. Somewhere in that mixture, Miss Marple knew, lay the first thread of a mystery. All that was required was patience, and patience, she reflected with a faint smile, was one quality she possessed in abundance. She blew out her candle, but sleep came slowly. Down the coast, the tide rose, like a secret preparing to reveal itself. Chapter 3: A Shadow in the Corridor. The corridors of Whitcomb Hall had the unsettling habit of seeming wider at night. By day, their wood paneling glowed with a honeyed warmth, and portraits of Whitcomb's past looked down with the indulgence of ancestors content to be remembered. But after the lamps were dimmed and footsteps became whispers, the same corridors stretched into something darker, long tunnels of silence punctuated by the creak of an old board or the faint sigh of draughts that found their way in through forgotten cracks. It was here, on the second night of Miss Marple's stay in St. Anne's, that unease began to bloom. Evening at the hall dinner had passed pleasantly enough, though the undercurrents of tension were harder to ignore. The Silver Locket, brought forth once again by Lady Whitcomb for the benefit of guests, seemed to dominate the atmosphere like an uninvited but unavoidable relative. Felix Vane admired it with a connoisseur's enthusiasm. Cousin Cora complained that it should never have been touched, and Arthur Whitcomb, restless and impatient, declared, "Ha!" A midnight disturbance. It was close to midnight when the first sound came, a muffled creak, followed by the faint scuff of a shoe against stone. Mary, the young maid tasked with tidying the morning room, froze with her candle halfway down the passage. She had been slow to finish her chores, distracted by village gossip about the locket, and now found herself in the deserted corridor leading toward the gallery where the casket rested. The sound came again, footsteps, measured but hesitant, as though someone moved with intent but without the confidence of belonging. Mary clutched her candle, the flame trembling with her hand. She swore afterward she saw it, a figure in the half-dark, tall and indistinct, pausing by the very door that led to the Locket's chamber. The figure bent, fumbled at the handle, then straightened sharply at the sound of her gasp. Before she could cry out, the shadow slipped away down the passage, vanishing into the warren of halls as if the house had swallowed it whole. The household, alarmed, Mary burst into the servants' quarters, white-faced, startling the footmen and the cook from their cards. Breathless, she stammered about the shadow, the door, the locket. Within moments the alarm reached the butler, Mr. Latham, who carried himself to Lady Whitcomb's chamber with the solemnity of a man announcing an invasion. The family assembled in their dressing gowns and slippers, confusion giving way to indignation as the story unfolded. Arthur insisted it must have been one of the staff imagining things. Cora Nash declared it proof that the locket brought doom upon the house. Evelyn, pale but resolute, begged her mother to secure the casket more firmly. Dr. Hart clapped everyone on the shoulder, laughing too loudly, and suggested the culprit was nothing more sinister than a draft. Miss Marple, standing a little apart, observed quietly. She asked Mary only two questions: how tall the figure seemed and whether it made any sound besides footsteps. Mary, still trembling, insisted the figure was taller than Arthur, perhaps, and that it moved with surprising quietness, almost gliding. Gliding, Miss Marple repeated softly, filing the word away. The discovery when at last they went to the gallery: the casket was still in place, its lock undisturbed. The locket, when Lady Whitcomb lifted the lid with steady hands, gleamed as it had before, silver, catching the candlelight like a smile with secrets. Nothing was missing, nothing had changed, and yet the unease lingered. The house, with all its silent passages and shadowed corners, now seemed complicit in something half-finished. Lady Whitcomb, with a voice that cut through murmurs, declared the matter closed. The locket would remain secured. The servants were not to speak of the incident beyond their quarters. "We shall not," she said firmly, "let fear do what curses never could." But Cousin Cora muttered darkly that curses did not need help, they simply waited. Miss Marple reflects later, as she sat in her modest room at Seaview House. Miss Marple set down her knitting to consider. Shadows, she reflected, are useful things. They conceal, they stretch, they mislead. A frightened maid might easily mistake one guest for another, or a trick of light for something more deliberate. And yet Mary's story carried the ring of sincerity. The detail of the gliding steps, the pause at the door, the hurried retreat. Miss Marple's long life had taught her that truth often wears the plainest clothes, even when carried by the simplest mouths. If nothing had been taken, then the intruder had either been interrupted or had wished only to look. That, Miss Marple thought, was often more dangerous than theft. Curiosity, once awakened, was not easily put back to bed. Closing scene: down the coast. The tide pressed itself against the cliffs with insistent rhythm. The village slept, but at Whitcomb Hall sleep was uneasy. Behind heavy doors and shuttered windows, the locket lay quiet in its velvet bed, gleaming softly as though amused by the stir it had caused. Miss Marple, before blowing out her candle, murmured a line she had once heard in a churchyard: "It is not the dead we need fear in the dark, but the living who walk with them." She set her spectacles aside, closed her eyes, and allowed the night to settle. Somewhere in the hall, a shadow had walked, and shadows, she knew, always belonged to someone. Chapter 4. The first death dawn arrived to St. Anselm's like a letter opened quietly. Mist lay across the lawns of Whitcomb Hall. Beads of moisture clung to the yew hedges and made the roses look newly considered. A gardener's barrow, neatly arranged with twine and stood by the potting shed as if awaiting its owner's final instructions. It was the undergardener, Tom Bryce Young, earnest, easily embarrassed by conversation with ladies who found the body. He was carrying a coil of hose toward the sundial when he stopped so abruptly that the coil slipped and knocked against his ankles. For a long moment he did not move at all. Early light had a way of making even the ordinary unfamiliar, and there was nothing ordinary about a man in evening clothes lying crooked at the foot of the rose terrace. The white gravel glittered around him. A single scarlet petal clung absurdly to his sleeve. Tom dropped the hose and ran. By the time Miss Marple reached the garden, summoned by Miss Hargrave's frightened knock and brought at once by habit and the strange courtesy of misfortune, people were already assembling. Lady Whitcomb arrived with the pace of one who never hurried but was never late to duty. Arthur came after, coat flung on over shirts. Evelyn Paley steadied the young gardener with a hand on his arm. Dr. Julius Hart, summoned from the breakfast room, knelt by the body with professional economy. It was Felix Vane. His dark hair was damp with dew, his collar twisted, his hands relaxed in a way that suggested not peace but the absence of argument. There was a livid bruise at his temple, half hidden where the marble lip of the sundial had nicked him on his way down. Nearby, a length of rose cane had been broken, thorns black-tipped with blood. Dead, Dr. Hart said calmly, though his throat worked. Several hours at least. A blow to the head from a fall, whether caused or accidental, we must determine. Lady Whitcomb's voice was steady. He cannot have fallen without reason. No one wanders into a formal garden at such an hour, unless to keep an appointment, said Cousin Cora, who had appeared ghost-like in grey, or to admire stolen goods by moonlight. Arthur rounded on her. For heaven's sake, Cora. But the words had done their work. Uneasy glances travelled like birds along a wire. Miss Marple, careful not to step where she oughtn't, let her eyes move where hers alone would. The gravel had been scuffed into a faint arc near the sundial. There were two kinds of prints, one sharp-edged, narrow and deep, the other broader, less definite, as if made by a heavier man or a shoe with a smoother sole. On the clipped edge of the lawn she noticed something small and bright. She stooped, and with a handkerchief lifted it, a sliver of mother-o', the crescent tip of a dress shirt stud perhaps, or the decorative face of a cufflink. She said nothing. Instead, she looked at Felix Vane's hands, clean, unmarked save for a faint smear of green across the right thumb, the sort gardeners acquire, but Mr. Vane would not. There was also a sweetness in the air, but that was only the roses, heavy with last night's damp. Where is Sir Lionel? Miss Marple asked gently, because a practical question can shore up a trembling moment. In his study, said Evelyn. Mr. Latham went to fetch him. She swallowed. Mother, we ought to send for the police. Lady Whitcomb inclined her head once. Yes, Mr. Latham, see that Constable Pritchard is notified at once. And she turned to Dr. Hart. Julius, will you remain? Of course, he said. He had composed his features into a reassuring arrangement. No one is to touch the body. We shall cover him until the constable arrives. As the butler dispatched a footman at a run, the household, with a peculiar choreography of disaster, drifted into small knots, the servants whispering, Arthur vibrating with restless energy, Evelyn quietly efficient, Cora observing as a cat observes a fishbowl. Miss Marple moved a little apart and, so far as anyone might in a scene with so many eyes, examined the ground. She noticed another small thing. On the edge of the sundial's plinth, a smear of something dark, as if someone's heel had slipped, and at the base of a rose standard, the tiniest thread of pale wool caught on a thorn too fine for a gardener's garb. Miss Marple, who knew the language of threads and hems and the life they led when their wearers were busy being dramatic, tucked the observation away beside the mother of Pearl. Constable Pritchard arrived with apology on his boots and solemnity on his cap, followed shortly by Inspector Hewitt from the county. Thoughtful, a man whose quiet made people feel it for him. Statements were taken with care. Tom Bryce repeated his discovery and blushed whenever Evelyn thanked him. The inspector listened the way good listeners do, not for words, but for the spaces between them. And when was Mr. Vane last seen? Inspector Hewitt asked. In the library at 11:30, said Arthur. We had a hand at bridge. He left early, said he had letters to write. Was he a smoker? Hewitt's nostrils flared slightly, as men's do when they inventory a room. I smell no tobacco, cigarettes, occasionally, said Dr. Hart. But he did not smoke last evening in my sight. Lady Whitcomb, composed as winter, spoke next. Mr. Vane's room should be examined. Mr. Latham will assist you. You have my permission, Inspector. The party moved inward slowly with the reluctance of people leaving a story at the wrong page. Miss Marple remained until they had carried a sheet to protect the remains. She looked once, gently, at Felix Vane's face. Death had taken from it the easy charm and left behind something that felt like truth. He was young enough still to be surprised by the world's refusals. Inside the hall, a new disturbance awaited them. Mr. Latham, grey with dismay, met Lady Whitcomb in the corridor outside the morning room. "My lady, the casket," he gestured. "It has been opened. The locket is gone." There was a brief, companionable silence in which even the house seemed to hold its breath. Then Cora's voice, sharp with vindication. "There, do you see? Evil travels with that thing as surely as a snail leaves its trail." Evelyn gripped the back of a chair, knuckles whitening. "When? How?" Mr. Latham's professionalism rallied. "I locked the room myself at midnight, on your instruction, my lady. The key is kept in the small drawer in my pantry. This morning, when I came to dust the silver, the door was ajar, no sign of forsand, the casket empty. No servant has left their post since dawn. I had a roll call." Inspector Hewitt examined the lock with a neat little torch he produced from an inner pocket. "No scratches. Whoever opened this had a key or hands practiced in courtesy." He looked up at Lady Whit. "How many keys?" "2," she said. "Mr. Latham's and mine." "3," murmured Miss Marple, not contradicting so much as musing aloud. "If one counts the key that suited the locket itself, once upon a time." The inspector acknowledged her with a brief nod. He had been told who she was. "We shall of course search the house. No one is to leave." Arthur bristled. "Are we prisoners, then?" "We are careful," the inspector replied. "Care is rarely imprisonment, Mr. Whit. It is often the opposite." They searched Mr. Vane's room first. It was sparely elegant, clothes arranged with the tidy vanity of a man who liked the idea of himself. On the dressing table, Miss Marple noted a pair of shirt studs, one intact pair in mother-of pearl, another with a single tip damaged, its crescent chipped away. She said nothing. Inspector Hewitt noticed too. A glance passed between them like a footnote. There were no letters. There was, however, a faint smear of green on the inside of a jacket cuff, the same green Miss Marple had noticed on Mr. Vane's thumb. Sap, perhaps, or crushed leaf. The roses again. Back downstairs. Dr. Hart set delicate cups of tea in front of the ladies with hands that did not quite tremble. "Shock is an unkind guest," he said gently. "Tea makes poor company bearable." He looked tired. Miss Marple watched the doctor's eyes. They carried the weight of a man who had stood near to many endings. Mr. Vane admired the locket. Miss Marple said conversationally, as if remarking upon the weather. "Did he admire anything else?" "Everything," said Evelyn with a faint, rueful smile. "He was that sort of man. He could admire a postage stamp into a treasure." "Admiration," Miss Marple agreed, "is a useful quality in society. It is also a dangerous one in a garden at midnight." Cora gave her a sharp look. "You think he went to steal it and tumbled for his greed?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that people rarely tumble without a push, even if the push is their own temperament. But there are also other hands." Inspector Hewitt returned from a brief conference with Mr. Latham. "We will ask everyone to remain available today. My men will canvass the grounds." He paused. "Mr. Vane's cuff-link is damaged. A fragment was found in the garden, Mrs. Whitcomb. May we have the garments worn by the household last night?" Lady Whitcomb inclined her head. Of course, when the inspector had gone, Miss Marple rose. "If I may," she said to Evelyn, "I should like to see the Rose Terrace once more." They went together. The mist was lifting. The sundial's shadow, slender and decisive, pointed toward a morning that insisted on being ordinary. Miss Marple knelt with a creak of protest from sensible knees and examined a thorn where the pale wool thread had caught. It was a pale grapevine and springy. Evelyn followed her gaze and flushed. "That could be mine. I wore my grey wrap when I went out earlier to fetch Arthur from the smoking room." "At what hour?" "Just after 11. She hesitated. "But I came nowhere near the terrace. I went out onto the east lawn. Arthur likes the air in any case. I did not pass this way." "Threads wander," said Miss Marple kindly. "They do not confess. They only suggest." She straightened slowly and looked back toward the hall, its windows catching light. Somewhere inside, a small silver absence had joined the morning's inventory. On the gravel, 2 sets of prints spoke without names. In the rosebed, a broken cane kept its counsel. Felix Vane lay in the cool shade now, attended by propriety. The village would, by noon, have 10 explanations. By evening, 20. Miss Marple had none. She was prepared to speak, but she had a sense, as one has of rain before clouds gather, that the locket had not summoned tragedy so much as provided a stage for it. And somewhere, in the space between admiration and avarice, between family pride and private folly, the first act had ended. Chapter 5, Suspicions. Miss Marple reflected, had as many disguises as hypocrisy. By noon, Whit Hall no longer resembled a home, but rather a stage upon which each member of the household performed their particular role in the tragedy of Felix Vane's untimely death. Lady Whitcomb presided with iron composure, her poise so absolute that the servants obeyed her as if she were the law itself. Arthur stormed from room to room, unable to be still. Evelyn moved gently among them all, soothing the cook, offering tea to the constable, reassuring young Mary the maid that she had not been at fault. Cousin Cora, meanwhile, whispered her venom with the satisfaction of one whose gloomy predictions had come to pass. The inspector remained measured, though there was no mistaking the sharpness with which his eyes traveled from one face to another. The inspector questions Mr. Vane was last seen alive at 11:30. Inspector Hewitt reminded them as they sat once more in the morning room, yet by dawn he lay dead in the garden. Between those hours, every one of you retired. I must ask plainly, did anyone hear or see anything unusual in the night? Arthur was first to reply. I heard nothing. I was in the smoking room with a book until 1. If Mr. Vane left letters unfinished, it was not in my company you saw him leave the library. Hewitt asked. Yes, he went toward the east wing. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, noted this. Arthur's eagerness to supply direction, as though steering suspicion elsewhere. Evelyn admitted she had walked briefly outside near midnight, wrapped in her grey shawl. The air clears my mind when I cannot sleep, but I swear I never went near the terrace. Her voice faltered but steadied again. Cora leaned forward. That girl would never admit it, but she has always disliked Felix. Perhaps she feared what he might reveal. Evelyn colored, protesting, but Lady Whitcomb's sharp glance silenced them both. Dr. Hart cleared his throat. I heard a door close somewhere down the passage, but I assumed it was a servant. The house has many noises. Noise often tells the truth, murmured Miss Marple. We only need to know how to listen. Rumors in the village. By afternoon the entire village hummed with speculation. At the inn, patrons whispered of Felix Vane's charm, of how icily he drew women into confidences, of debts quietly settled and unsettled. Some said he had been too familiar with Lady Whitcomb herself. Others suggested Evelyn, though most dismissed this as slander. Miss Hargrave reported the gossip over supper at Seaview House. You'd think the locket itself had committed murder, the way people speak of it. They say its curse has claimed another victim. I say nonsense, but nonsense breeds faster than daisies. Miss Marple stirred her tea. Superstitions provide a convenient answer when real answers are uncomfortable. Much safer to blame Silver than neighbors. Confidences and conflicts. That evening Miss Marple returned to the hall under pretext of delivering a basket of preserves from Miss Hargrave. Evelyn met her at the door and eagerly drew her aside. I cannot bear it, Evelyn whispered. The inspector watches us all as though we were guilty. Arthur quarreled with Felix only yesterday over money. I fear what may come of it. Your brother, Miss Marple said gently, is a young man of strong tempers, but quarrels do not always end in blows. Evelyn's eyes filled with doubt. But the locket is gone, too. If Felix stole it, then why was it not found on him? That Miss Marple agreed, is indeed a question. Upstairs, meanwhile, Cousin Cora cornered Arthur. Best to tell the truth before the inspector drags it out of you. You hated Felix, you said as much. He mocked you, and you cannot abide mockery. Arthur's fist clenched. Careful, Cora, you'll find yourself regretting your tongue. But Cora only smiled thinly. Regret, dear boy, is reserved for those who fail to prepare. Miss Marple, hearing fragments of their voices through a half-closed door, thought of how resentment hardens like limescale in a kettle unseen until the water tastes bitter. A visit to the servants' wing. Miss Marple also sought quiet words with Mary, the maid who had seen the shadow in the corridor. You are quite sure of what you saw? She asked kindly. Mary nodded. Tall, Miss, and quick, like he'd been startled. Not Mr. Vane. He walked differently. This one. He moved quiet, like he knew the house, like a member of the family. Mary bit her lip. I daren't say sometimes, Miss Marple said softly. Daring is not required. Only noticing. Closing reflection. That night, alone in her small room, Miss Marple considered her notes. Felix Vane, dead in the garden, cufflink broken, green smear on his hand. The locket, vanished without a trace. Arthur Poirot, anger, too quick to supply alibis. Evelyn, frightened honesty, but the grey thread snagged on the rose. Cora, eager to accuse, but why so persistent? Dr. Hart, ever genial, yet the door he heard may matter greatly. She set aside her knitting and sighed. Human nature, she knew, is rarely tidy. Each carried a secret. Each had motive enough to reach for silver or for silence. The mystery, she felt, was not whether Felix Vane had been killed, but why he had been silenced. And in that answer lay the truth of the locket, its curse, and the shadows that prowled Whitcomb Hall. Outside, the sea continued its endless breathing, as if mocking the small tragedies of mankind. Chapter 6. A cryptic letter. The day after Felix Vane's death broke sharp and bright, as if the weather had been polished. It was a treacherous sort of sunshine, the kind that persuades people to believe in simple answers. Miss Marple, who mistrusted simplicity when offered to readily, finished her tea at Seaview House and set out for Whitcomb Hall with a small parcel of scones. Miss Hargrave insisted would be the first sensible thing anyone has eaten in that house since Tuesday. At the service entrance, she was met not by the butler but by Mary. The maid's eyes were red-rimmed, not only from fright but from the tired ache that comes when events are too large for a life measured by corridor lengths and dusting schedules. Miss Mary whispered, drawing Miss Marple into the pantry. I think I've found something I oughtn't to keep. From beneath her apron she produced an envelope the color of old cream. It had been folded many times, and along one edge showed the serration of a page torn from a larger book. A wax seal had once secured it. now broken. On the flap lingered a smudge of black that might have been candle soot or the careless thumb of time. On the front, in a compact, slanted hand, to be shown only if the locket returns. No name. Where did you find it, Mary? In my room, Miss. I was turning the mattress like Mr. Latham says before midsummer, and the seam had come loose. This was tucked inside, right by the ticking. I swear I never saw it before, but my straw tick came down from the lumber room last year, when Miss Hargrave took me on. Her lips trembled. I thought after what I saw in the corridor it might matter. It does you credit, Miss Marple said, and meant it. They took the letter to Lady Whitcomb, who read the inscription once and then, with a look that contained both iron and fatigue, broke the flap. The family gathered at her request. Arthur strung as tight as a bootlace. Evelyn, anxious and pale. Cora Nash, with the alert gleam of someone expecting to be confirmed in a dreary opinion. Dr. Hart, Inspector Hewitt, and Mr. Latham, who understood that certain moments require a butler as one requires punctuation. Inside the envelope lay a single page of thick paper, faintly watermarked Traxel & Co. Stationers, Bath. The date in the corner read May 3, 1894. The hand was different from the inscription, larger, less educated, each letter leaning as though it needed the next for support. Lady Whitcomb began to read aloud. Mrs. Whit, if this should be put before you, then certain matters have failed of their keeping. You will not know me. I am Eliza Pike, lately maid to Miss Isabella's daughter when she was at the Dower House. I write to say the silver keeps what it should not. I have seen papers, and I have hid one key. The gentleman Dr. J. Hart said it were mercy, but mercy can be wicked when it thrives in dark. It is not for me to judge, only to leave a sign for one who is rightful. The sun at noon points truest, where the shadow shows north. There is a hollow stone that answers to Isabella's name. The silver bites those that break faith. Trust the elder branch. Silence fell like dust. Then three things happened at once. Arthur exclaimed, "That's nonsense." The ravings of a servant. Cora declared, "I told you, the locket carried ruin with it." And Dr. Hart, color ebbing, said very quietly, "J. Hart. My grandfather was Jonathan Hart. He served the Whitcombs for 40 years. Inspector Hewitt took the page. With your permission. He turned it against the light. Watermark, as Miss Marple would have noticed. Fold lines many. It's been read and reread. The ink is browned. Old iron gall. And H.M. He frowned. There are words underlined: sun north, stone, Isabella, elder. Miss Marple drifted nearer, appearing to fuss with her spectacles. If Miss Pike was who she says, she knew how to hide a message in plain view. Servants keep counsel without education. They learn their own ciphers. Underline. The first letters of those underlined words, perhaps. Hewitt looked down again, mouthing S, N-S-I-E. He shook his head. Or the order in which they appear. Miss Marple said mildly, "Sometimes a housemaid's prayer book teaches better puzzles than a college." Lady Whitcomb reclaimed the paper. The underlined words are these: sun at noon, shadow shows north, hollow stone, Isabella's name, trust the elder branch. She read the sentence again, slower this time. We have a sundial on the Rose Terrace. At noon, its shadow lies north. She glanced at Inspector Hewitt. You stood there yesterday. We all did, he said, where Mr. Vane fell. Then the letter points to the sundial, Evelyn said softly, a hollow stone, and answers to Isabella's name, Miss Marple added. Family sundials often bear mottos. Does yours? It does, Lady Whitcomb replied. Horace nan numero nisi serenas, but Isabella's name. She paused, then turned to Mr. Latham. Fetch the terrace plans. There is a stone bench installed there when the garden was altered during Isabella's time. Mr. Latham, who could lay hands on history as other men lay hands on hatstands, disappeared and returned with a rolled drawing onion skin crinkle spread upon the table. It showed the terrace in neat ink lines, the sundial at the center, two benches flanking, the bed arrangements numbered like polite regiments. In the margin, a note: bench Isabella's seat from Dower House. Installed 1793, answers to Isabella's name. Miss Marple repeated. If there were a hollow beneath or within the seat. Arthur gave a short laugh. And how many stones must we pry up to satisfy a maid's melodrama? Enough, said Lady Whitcomb with a look that permitted neither impatience nor fear, to learn what my family has chosen not to know. Inspector Hewitt folded the letter and placed it carefully in his pocketbook. We will examine the bench. Meanwhile, Dr. Hart, this mention of your grandfather. The doctor nodded, eyes lowered. Jonathan Hart was a good man. But good men in those years were not strangers to paternalism, Inspector. If there was a secret that he believed would protect a name, he might have colluded with it. He met Lady Whitcomb's gaze with respect. If so, I'm sorry for the legacy. Cora sniffed. What legacy? The old scandal that Isabella had a child not quite counted. Everyone whispered it. Evelyn flinched. Cora, please. Miss Marple, who had seen scandals age into myth like cheese, said nothing. She was looking again at the letter at the margins. May I? At Lady Whitcomb's nod, she held it close. Along the edge, faint indentations impressed by a hard nib but never inked formed a ghostly ladder. She tilted the paper to the window. "Someone wrote a list over this page," she murmured. 4 words, pressed so hard their bones show. "Keystone Seat North." And an initial at the bottom. EP. She looked up. Eliza Pike kept her own receipt, as it were. "Then the matter is simple," said Arthur, too quickly. "We search the seat, find nothing, and consign this relic to the fire. Or," Miss Marple said, "we find something that explains why Felix Vane stood last night by the sundial with green on his thumb." Arthur's mouth opened, then closed. A faint color came into his face. "What do you mean?" "Roses bruise green," Miss Marple replied, "and ivy does too. But there is another green that comes off stone when old mortar is disturbed. A man who worried at a bench's edge by moonlight might carry it on his skin." Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth. "You think Felix?" "I think someone read this letter before we did," Miss Marple said gently. "Perhaps long ago. Perhaps recently. The envelope says to be shown only if the locket returns. Mary found it because her mattress came from the lumber room last year. Before that, who knows where it lay and whose hands explored the room where it hid." Inspector Hewitt straightened. Decisions arranged themselves across his face. "Mr. Latham, will you take me to the terrace?" They went out in a small procession, Lady Whitcomb with that measured step that refuses to grant victory to shock, Evelyn and Arthur an uneasy concert, Cora prickly with expectation, Dr. Hart somber, Miss Marple small and unhurried, attending to a world that spoke in trifles. On the terrace, the sundial stood as they had left it, its shadow a dark arrow upon the gravel. The bench labeled Isabella's seat was a simple thingstone, slab upon 2 carved supports, each with a at the inner corner of the right-hand support, a pale scar showed, as if a chisel had once tested its virtue. Inspector Hewitt knelt, probing gently with a pot. Flakes of old lime gave way with a dry whisper. "There," he said. A cavity Mr. Latham produced, as if by conjuration, a small screwdriver. The inspector prized a square of stone, cleverly mortised, lifted at last. Inside a narrow recess yawned. All eyes leaned. Within lay nothing. The hollow was empty, but for a feather of cobweb in a dark, brittle curl that might have been a shaving from long ago would. Evelyn swayed. Lady Whitcomb caught her arm. Arthur exhaled in a sound like impatience broken into pieces. "Emptied," said Miss Marple softly. "Of course." Inspector Hewitt lowered the stone back with care. "Then Miss Pike's key was once here and someone took it. The question is when." He dusted his hands, straightened, and looked from face to face. If the key opened the locket, what lay inside was worth moving heaven and stone for. "Papers," murmured Lady Whitcomb. "Codicils, proofs. The past has such tiresome ways of insisting upon the present." Cora's smile was thin as wire. "Or a confession, Caroline. Perhaps Isabella wrote what she should not, and Felix Vane read it." "Felix could not have opened the locket without the key," Evelyn said, more to herself than to Cora. Unless he had it, or bargained for it," Miss Marple added. "It is an old game exchanging a promise for a small metal fact." She looked at Dr. Hart. "If Jonathan Hart hid the key here with Eliza Pike's help, then someone perhaps not long ago learned that trick and took advantage." Dr. Hart's face was troubled. "If my family is entangled, I will own it, but I cannot yet see how." Miss Marple's eyes returned to the sundial. "The letter gave us a direction. It tells us something else, too. Trust the elder branch. Family quarrels, inheritances. It is a phrase people use when an entail is not what it seems." Lady Whitcomb's gaze did not waver. "Speak plainly, Miss Marple, in plain terms," Miss Marple said. "If there was a paper in the locket that altered the line of inheritance, someone might kill to keep it silent or to make it speak. The elder branch would benefit or be threatened depending on the wording, and anyone who realized this Felix Vane, for instance, might see the locket not as a bauble but as leverage." The sea answered for a moment. Far off, like a thought breathing, the terrace smelled of roses and old stone. Above them, gulls wheeled with their usual selfishness. Inspector Hewitt closed his notebook. "We will search the lumber room and the old dower house. We will learn what we can of Miss Eliza Pike and Dr. Jonathan Hart, and we will find out who, in this present household, has put old secrets to modern use." Miss Marple, feeling the curious lift of the heart that comes when a pattern begins to show through cloth, inclined her head. The letter had not given them the key, but it had told them where the key had once been, and that was almost as good, because where a key has rested, fingerprints of a sort remain not on stone, but upon minds, and minds, Miss Marple knew, were her favorite surfaces to dust. Chapter 7. The second tragedy. The morning after the cryptic letter's discovery, Whitcomb Hall lay under a veil of nervous expectation. The household moved as if each step might disturb some fragile balance. Breakfast, usually a formality attended in subdued silence, was consumed hastily. The air hummed with unspoken questions. Who had taken the locket, and what had Felix Vane stumbled upon before his death? Miss Marple, who had already risen early and walked the dewy lane, found the atmosphere telling. The hall itself seemed strained, as if its old timbers carried secrets too long suppressed. She observed how Arthur attacked his eggs with unnecessary vigor, how Cora pecked at toast like a crow, eager for crumbs of scandal, and how Evelyn stirred her tea absent-mindedly. her grey shawl draped around her shoulders. Though the day was warm, Lady Whitcomb alone maintained composure, her voice calm as she reminded them that Inspector Hewitt would return to search the lumber room. "We shall not live under the tyranny of shadows," she declared. But shadows, as Miss Marple knew, had a way of ignoring instructions. An afternoon interruption. The household dispersed to its various corners. Miss Marple settled in the small parlor with her knitting, positioned so she could hear both the clock's tick and the servants passing. Shortly after 3, a commotion rose from the east wing, a cry, sharp and frightened, followed by the hurried patter of feet. Miss Marple set down her work and moved with surprising swiftness toward the sound. She was not the first to arrive. Evelyn lay collapsed on the landing, pale as linen, her hand clenched tightly around something small. Mary the maid hovered, wringing her apron, while Arthur knelt by his sister's side, torn between anger and alarm. "She fainted," Mary gasped. "I found her just like this near the gallery." Inspector Hewitt, summoned quickly by a footman, appeared moments later. He knelt beside Evelyn, who was breathing but shallowly, her lashes fluttering against her cheeks. Miss Marple bent low, coaxing open the young woman's fingers. What she revealed caused even the inspector to start. A short length of fine silver chain, broken, one link jagged where it had been wrenched apart. "The locket," Arthur breathed. "Where did you—" I don't know," Evelyn whispered faintly, returning to consciousness. "It was in my hand when I woke. I swear I never touched it before." Questions without answers, the inspector's gaze moved from Evelyn to Arthur, then to Miss Marple. "Someone placed it upon her, or she stumbled upon it herself. Either way, this means the locket is still within the house." "But why put it in my hand?" Evelyn cried softly, tears trembling in her eyes. "What possible purpose to frighten you?" Miss Marple said gently. "Or to cast suspicion?" Cora's voice cut like wire. "Or perhaps she found it where she should not have looked. A guilty conscience often masquerades as faintness." Arthur surged to his feet. "How dare you?" His fists clenched, but Evelyn caught his sleeve, begging him not to worsen matters. The inspector examined the chain. No locket attached, only the fragment. "Whoever handled it tore it roughly. We must search again." Evelyn's letter. When she had been restored with smelling salts and tea, Evelyn gave her account. She had been on her way to fetch a book from the gallery when she felt suddenly faint. Before she lost consciousness, she remembered a faint metallic scent, as though silver had been polished, and the sensation of something cold brushing her palm. When she awoke, the chain was there. Miss Marple listened attentively. "And you saw no one?" "No one," Evelyn insisted. "But I thought perhaps I heard the sound of silk against wood. Very soft." Miss Marple nodded. "Silk has its own voice, if one learns to hear it." New unease. The discovery changed the tenor of the house. Servants whispered of ghosts who carried jewelry to chosen victims. Cora spread dark mutterings about curses fulfilled. Arthur grew restless, pacing the corridors like a caged hound. Dr. Hart tried to lighten spirits but seemed distracted, his joviality fraying. Lady Whitcomb summoned them all to the drawing-room. Standing tall, she declared, "This ends now. The locket must be found. Inspector Hewitt will conduct a search of every chamber. No one will object. The honor of this family demands nothing less." Her words stilled argument, though not unease. Miss Marple's thoughts that evening. In the quiet of her room at Seaview House, Miss Marple reviewed her mental notes. Felix Vane's death had the look of violence half concealed, not accident. The locket had vanished only to reappear in fragments, taunting the household. And now Evelyn had been made a stage for someone's cruel little play, whether to weaken her, to frighten the family, or to conceal another's guilt. She thought of the cryptic letter, of Isabella's seat and the missing key, of Dr. Hart's troubled admission about his grandfather. The threads tangled, but not beyond untangling. Human motives, Miss Marple reflected, rarely altered with centuries. Greed, fear, love, and pride performed the same roles in every age. She folded her knitting neatly, preparing for sleep. Yet her mind lingered on one phrase from Evelyn's faint recollection. The sound of silk against wood. It was a detail others might dismiss. Miss Marple, however, knew better. Silks belong to women, usually, and sometimes to men who cultivate elegance. In this house, that narrowed the field considerably. Closing reflection outside, the tide advanced upon the rocks with a patience older than any wit. Within the hall, the family lay uneasy, their dreams troubled by broken chains and unseen hands. Miss Marple, before she closed her eyes, murmured to herself, "The locket is not cursed, but those who touch it may be." And in that thought, she sensed that tragedy had not yet finished its work. Chapter 8. The puzzle comes. Together at noon, the sun made honest men of shadows. Miss Marple, who placed great faith in the testimony of things that could not talk themselves out of trouble, asked Inspector Hewitt to meet her on the rose terrace precisely when the sundial grows dogmatic. He came, notebook in pocket, patience in his manner. "The letter's instruction," she said, "was not only a map to the bench. The sun at noon points truest, where the shadow shows north. Trust the elder branch. We took elder branch for the family line. I propose we let it be less allegorical." Hewitt lifted his brows. "Botany. If one has spent as long in village gardens as I have, Inspector, One knows an elder when one smells it, sweet and a little sour. There is a thicket just beyond the balustrade. They stood as the slim gnomon cast its dark spear straight toward the hedge's gap. Beyond, at the terrace's lip, a clump of elder had colonized a corner where stone gave way to soil. The air carried that faint catty scent elder keeps for those who pay. Attention. Miss Marple stepped carefully onto the grass. The letter's underlinings pointed us to Nuno North, Stone. We found the hollow, but trust the elder branch remained a riddle. Elders are obliging. Their pithy centers are easily scooped. People make whistles. They also make hiding places. Hewitt knelt at once without argument now, his knife flashing. In the largest bow, half concealed by lichen, was a narrow plug where bark didn't sit quite right. He eased it out. Within, something clicked against metal, small dull. He shook the branch. A sliver slid into his palm, a keeled silver, neat as a thought that has waited too long. They did not speak for a moment. Then Hewitt breathed. Miss Marple, I am in your debt. In Isabella's debt, Miss Marple corrected softly. And Miss Pike's elder branches keep counsel better than families. They did not shout for the household. Instead, they went very quietly by the back stair to the little morning room. Hewitt locked the door. Miss Marple set her handbag on the table as if making tea. He brought out the casket from the safe where he had placed it after the theft, empty as they had found it. The locket itself was missing, true, but the family had kept, at Miss Marple's urging, an old jewelry tray from Lady Whitcomb's dressing table where trifles were laid the night before the first dinner. In a shallow compartment beneath, overlooked until the inspector took to measuring the felt, lay the locket recovered that morning by a maid dusting nervously and too thoroughly. Tucked between lace cuffs as if in a hurry, no one had yet been told. Hewitt had wished to confirm its chain and clasp before announcing anything that would set the house in a fresh fever. Shall we? He said now, placing the silver oval on the table. Miss Marple's hands, neat and deft, received the key. It settled into the tiny keyhole as though to an old friend. The turn was silent. The hinge yielded with a tired sigh. Inside, not a miniature, no romantic curl of hair, but a paper coiled so small it might have been a seed. Hewitt lifted it with tweezers and, with the care of a man shaving a fuse, unrolled the brittle length upon blotting paper. He slid beneath. Words emerged in a fine, resolute hand. Memorandum to be witnessed by Dr. Jonathan Hart, of St. Anselm's, upon my death. I, Isabella Whitcomb, being of sound mind, do here declare that my lawful first marriage to Captain Roland Harcourt was dissolved by annulment before my second union to Thomas Whitcomb, and that the child issue of the first, Eleanor, born 1793, is legitimate. Failing her line, my property, not entailed, shall descend to the elder line of Eleanor. Signed this 7th day of February, 1794. Below, cramped but clear, a witness signature. Jonathan Hart. Hewitt sat back. So the whisper was wrong. Not an illegitimate child, but a legitimate one whose line was erased. Trust the elder branch indeed, the branch of the elder daughter, Eleanor, he exhaled. This appends expectation, it appends comfort, Miss Marple said, which is why such papers live in lockets and hedges. They looked at one another, the same thought arriving by two roads. Leverage. If Felix Vane had learned of the paper through gossip, through Dr. Hart's family history, through his own nimble snooping, it would make him dangerous in a house built upon the other branch. Who benefits? Hewitt asked, already rising to the next stone. Not Arthur, Miss Marple said gently, nor Evelyn, directly, if Eleanor's line exists elsewhere. But leverage is useful before it is proved. With a document, even unproven, one can threaten scandal, demand money, extract favors, and one can be killed for it. Hewitt finished. They agreed without saying it that the paper should not yet meet the drawing-room's appetite. Hewitt slid it into an evidence envelope, then into his breast pocket, where it crinkled like a secret learning to breathe. Two more matters, Miss Marple said. The chain left in Evelyn's hand intended to frighten or smear, and Felix's green-stained thumb, plus his broken cup. There were two pairs in his room, one with mother of mauve pearl crescent chipped. The fragment we found by the sundial marries to it. Someone met him there, Hewitt said. A struggle, a fall. But who put the chain on Miss Evelyn? Who wears silk that whispers? Miss Marple's eyes warmed, not unkindly. Men forget fabrics, she said. Women do not. The sound of silk against wood, someone kneeling by a chest, or easing a drawer. There are two consistent wearers of rustling silk in this house. Lady Whitcomb in her black day dress with silk, and Cousin Cora whose grey silk, so unlike Evelyn's wool, makes a small storm whenever she turns. Hewitt considered. Lady Whitcomb has authority, and no need of theatrics. Cora has need of everything, and motive. Miss Marple went on. If the memorandum elevates Eleanor's elder branch, then any Whitcomb not descended from Eleanor would fear disinheritance of certain properties, jewels, freehold cottages. Cora's pinched mouth speaks of an income to acquainted with. Corners. They left the morning room and walked apparently aimlessly through the east wing. At the gallery, Miss Marple paused by a narrow console where a small smear remained on the wood's edge. Dark and slightly greasy. She touched it with the corner of a handkerchief. A faint black came away. Candle soot, or wax smoke like the smudge on the envelope Mary had found. Someone who reads by candle in places where she ought not, Miss Marple murmured. Electric light makes one visible. A small taper makes one feel invisible. Cora keeps a taper in a silver holder on her bedside, does she not? Her maid said as much. Hewitt replied. She claims weak eyes. Some eyes grow weak in proportion to their curiosity, Miss Marple said. They followed another thread to the lumber room. Boxes, old screens, a cradle that remembered better lullabies. On a high shelf, a powdering of wax beads near a stack of mattress ticks. Beneath them, a faint crescent of mother-of-pearl glimmered, no, not pearl, but the shine of fishskin, the edge of a knife's old sheath. Nearby, tucked behind a picture frame, lay a single gray thread, fine and smooth silk, not wool. She read the letter here, Hewitt said, hearing the room confess. Perhaps long ago, perhaps again, lately, after the locket came out. She found Miss Pike's envelope once and returned it, not daring to destroy the only map, and when the locket reappeared, she moved too swiftly. Fear makes clumsy hands, Miss Marple said. So does greed. The chain in Evelyn's hand would have rattled her. It was bait and blame. They descended. In the hall they found Dr. Hart alone, staring at a portrait of Sternwick. He turned, guilt and sorrow uneasily married in his face. My grandfather's name, he said without preamble. I cannot decide whether to pray his conscience was true or to ask your inspector to indict it. Perhaps both. Miss Marple replied kindly. A good man can persuade himself that silence is medicine. But silence, like laudanum, creates its own illness. He managed a rueful breath. If the memorandum names an elder branch, then much changes. Truth usually does, said Miss Marple. But truth is rarely the assassin. The hand that killed Mr. Vane belongs to someone frightened of truth or eager to sell it. Cora joined them then. Grey silk whispering, lips thin with the satisfaction of approaching drama. Have you finished turning out our cupboards, Inspector? Do say you've found nothing. It would be so very like the police. On the contrary, Hewitt said with unusual mildness, we are beginning to find quite a lot. Cora's eyes flicked to Miss Marple, then away too quickly. Hands that liked to count slips also liked to keep them that evening. Miss Marple returned to Seaview House and wrote on a small card the order of things as she now saw them. Letter found in a mattress tick, smudged with wax, points to sundial, an elder, key an elder branch, locket opens, memorandum alters inheritance to Eleanor's elder line. Felix likely learned of this. The arranged meeting at the sundial, broken cup, fall by debate or design. Chain in Evelyn's hand, planted, silk rustle, candle soot on gallery console, grey silk thread in lumber room. Who fears the memorandum most? Not the mistress, who would face it, not the daughter, who would grieve but be brave, not the son, who Cora, who lives by other people's certainty. She set down her pencil. Patterns once shy were stepping into the light. Tomorrow, she thought, the drawing room would be full again. Tomorrow, if the inspector allowed, the unmasking could begin. But first there would be tea, for even truth benefits from civilities. Outside, the sea rode its endless line upon the shore, and above the hall the elder leaves shivered, lighter by a single secret. Chapter 9. The unmasking. The drawing room of Whitcomb Hall had never been so charged. Heavy curtains muted the afternoon light. The portraits on the wall seemed to lean forward, eager witnesses to the family's reckoning. Inspector Hewitt stood at one end of the room, his presence calm but resolute. At the other sat Lady Whitcomb, upright in her chair, her face set in grave determination. Arthur prowled near the mantel, restless as a caged animal. Evelyn sat close to her mother, hands clasped tight in her lap, her shawl gathered protectively about her shoulders. Cousin Cora hovered with a thin smile that looked more like anticipation than composure. Dr. Hart remained near the window, his expression troubled, almost apologetic. And in the midst of them all, Miss Marple, modest and unassuming, knitted quietly as if the entire affair were no more than a village squabble about jam jars. It was she who finally broke the silence, the gentle beginning. My dear Lady Whitcomb, Miss Marple said softly, you asked me to help see through the confusion that has troubled this house. The matter is delicate, but I believe the truth is now ready to be spoken. Truth, you see, is rather like a seed, it will push through, however deeply buried. Arthur gave a sharp laugh. If you mean to accuse me, get on with it. I have nothing to hide. Miss Marple did not look at him. It is seldom those who protest the loudest who are most guilty. Indeed, your temper is rather too obvious for subtle work. Felix's fatal secret. She folded her knitting and placed it neatly on the table. Felix Vane was no thief. He was an opportunist. He had somehow learned of the Whitcomb memorandum, perhaps from a careless remark, perhaps through an old connection to Dr. Hart's family. He arranged to meet someone on the terrace that night. The green stain on his thumb, the broken cuffling they tell us he was prizing at the hollow in Isabella's seat. He believed treasure lay there. Evelyn gasped. But it was empty. Yes, Miss Marple said. Empty because someone else had already removed the key. Felix had nothing to bargain with, save his knowledge. And knowledge, when not shared, can be dangerous. The shadow in the corridor. She turned her gaze to Mary the maid, standing timidly by the door. You saw a figure in the corridor that night. Tall, you said, and gliding. Not Mr. Vane. You saw Cousin Cora. Cora gave a startled laugh. Ridiculous. I was asleep in my room. Your grey silk gown, Miss Marple continued gently, makes a very particular sound, soft but insistent. Evelyn heard it the day she fainted, when someone placed a broken chain in her hand, and there was silk thread, snagged on a rose thorn at the terrace. Not wool, not linen silk, yours. The inspector produced the evidence bag with the thread, recovered by Miss Marple, tested this morning against the seam of your gown. They match. Cora's smile faltered. The planted evidence. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, as though explaining a recipe. When Felix threatened to use his knowledge, you met him at the sundial. Perhaps you promised to share what he found. But greed and fear make poor partners. There was a struggle, his cufflink broke, his head struck the stone, and he died. You might have meant only to push him away, but the result was fatal. Arthur muttered a curse, but Miss Marple raised her hand. Afterward, you took the locket and hid it in Lady Whitcomb's dressing table, thinking to recover it later. But suspicion grew too quickly. To deflect it, you planted the broken chain in Evelyn's hand, hoping her faint would serve as a cover. The candle suit on the gallery console, the wax smudge on the letter's envelope. Paul spoke of your habit of reading secrets by candle where you ought not to be. Motive revealed. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward. The memorandum inside the locket proves that Isabella's elder daughter, Eleanor, was legitimate. Her line had claim to certain freehold properties. If that became known, Cora, your portion would vanish entirely. You stood to lose the little you had. Cora's face tightened, eyes flashing. And what would you know of poverty, Inspector? Or you, Miss Marple, with your tidy cottages and your knitting? I have scraped and bowed for every penny of my allowance, while others dined in ease. Do you think I would let some scrap of paper consign me to bed? Her voice cracked, the bitterness spilling. Felix threatened to tell all. He thought to charm me, to frighten me into silence. Well, I silenced him. Evelyn recoiled, tears brimming. Cousin Cora, how could you? Because, Cora snapped, no one ever remembers the poor relation unless she claws her way into notice. The arrest. Inspector Hewitt's voice was steady. Cora Nash, I must ask you to accompany me to the station. She laughed again, but the sound had no So this is justice. A Whitcomb cousin marched out like a criminal, while the rest keep their fortunes. Well, perhaps curses are real, Miss Marple, only they take the shape of family blood. 2 constables, summoned earlier, stepped forward. Cora straightened her gown, silk rustling, and allowed herself to be led away. Aftermath. In the drawing room, silence lingered after she was gone. Lady Whitcomb's face was unreadable, though her hands trembled slightly on the chair's arms. Miss Marple, she said at last, we owe you more than gratitude. You have given us truth, however bitter. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. Truth, Lady Whitcomb, is rarely sweet, but it is always nourishing, and it clears the ground for peace to grow again. Arthur dropped heavily into a chair, his bravado spent. Evelyn leaned against her mother, eyes closed, relief and sorrow mingled. Dr. Hart spoke quietly. Perhaps my grandfather's silence has at last been answered. If so, I shall bear the shame of his name with acceptance. Miss Marple's reflection later as she walked back along the lane to Seaview House. Miss Marple reflected on the strange persistence of human folly. The locket itself had been innocent silver and quiet, yet into it generations had poured greed, pride, and fear, until the weight of secrets became deadly. Curses, she murmured to herself, are only the names we give to the mischief of human hearts. The sea, eternal and unconcerned, crashed against the cliffs as though in agreement. Chapter 10. Justice and Reflection. The storm that had hung over Whitcomb Hall for days seemed to break the following morning not with thunder, but with silence. The household, lighter by one member, moved in subdued calm. Servants went about their duties with renewed order. Windows were opened to the salt breeze. The chiming of the long case clock sounded less oppressive. Cora Nash, taken away under police escort, left behind a vacuum filled with equal parts relief and sorrow. Tragedy is rarely tidy. It carries with it bruises that remain long after the culprit is removed. Lady Whitcomb sat at the head of the breakfast table with her usual composure, but there was a shadow in her eyes as she folded the morning paper and pushed it aside. Evelyn looked pale yet resolute, while Arthur, subdued, avoided everyone's gaze, ashamed of his earlier outbursts. Only Miss Marple, sipping her tea with quiet satisfaction, seemed entirely at peace. She had seen this before, the curious calm after storms of human making. A conversation with Lady Whitcomb later that morning. Lady Whitcomb invited Miss Marple into the library. The heavy curtains were drawn wide, letting the September light fall across rows of old books. My dear Miss Marple, she began, you have rendered us a service that cannot be repaid. Without you, we might have lingered in suspicion forever. Miss Marple inclined her head modestly. It is always people, not objects, who carry mischief. Lady Whitcomb, the locket was merely a vessel, though. I dare say Isabella never imagined her memorandum would prove so combustible. Lady Whitcomb smiled faintly. It has altered little in practice. The Whitcomb estates entailed to Lionel remain untouched, but Cora's portion will indeed be called into question. Perhaps she saw more clearly than any of us how precarious her life was. Poverty is often sharper than pride. Miss Marple said gently, and it can drive the best of us to folly. Not that murder should ever be excused, but it is sometimes explained. Evelyn's resolve. Evelyn entered then, her shawl wrapped firmly about her shoulders. Mother, I've been thinking, if Eleanor's descendants can be found, we must make some provision for them. The memorandum may no longer carry legal weight, but it was Isabella's wish. Surely that should mean something. Lady Whitcomb looked at her daughter, pride softening her severity. You have a tender heart, my dear. We shall see what can be done. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Families prosper best when they honor the kindnesses of the past, not merely the riches. You will find that generosity leaves fewer quarrels than inheritance ever does. Inspector Hewitt's farewell. Inspector Hewitt returned in the afternoon to conclude his inquiries. He was brisk but courteous, confirming that Cousin Cora had confessed enough to ensure her guilt would not be doubted. She admitted to meeting Mr. Vane by the sundial, quarreling with him, and striking him when he threatened to expose her. He reported, she may claim panic rather than intent, but the law will take its course. Lady Whitcomb inclined her head. Justice, Inspector, is sometimes the only balm a family may have. Hewitt turned to Miss Marple. Madam, I owe you more than I can say. You noticed threads where I saw only cloth. Not at all, Miss Marple said, smiling. You did the heavier lifting. I merely observed, as old women do. We see patterns because we have spent our lives darning them. Miss Marple's reflection that evening. Back at Seaview House, Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window with her knitting in her lap. The sea rolled endlessly, gulls wheeled in the fading light, and the air smelled of salt and roses. She thought of Felix Vane, calming, careless, undone by greed; of Cora Nash, resentful, frightened, undone by envy; of Isabella Whitcomb, who had trusted a maid and a doctor to guard her truth; and of Evelyn, who would carry forward not only the family's name but its conscience. Evil rarely lies in objects, Miss Marple murmured to herself. It lies in the hands that reach for them, and in the hearts that cannot let go. The locket itself, now secured in the inspector's keeping, was nothing more than silver and hinges. Its so-called curse had been no more than the sum of human passions: greed, jealousy, pride, and fear. Yet those passions had claimed lives and left scars. A quiet ending the next morning. Miss Hargrave fussed over Miss Marple's luggage. I do hope this little adventure hasn't tired you out, she said. One never expects murder when one takes in lodgers for sea air. My dear Miss Hargrave, Miss Marple said with a smile. Life has a way of providing excitement whether we wish it or not. But I assure you, nothing restores the spirits like a pot of tea and a good walk. She boarded the small train at St. Anselm's Halt, carpet-bag neatly beside her, parasol in hand. As the countryside slipped past, she reflected, as she always did, that mysteries are simply puzzles written by human nature, and human nature, however well disguised, will always reveal itself in time. The train rattled on, carrying Miss Marple back toward St. Mary Mead, back to her garden and her church teas, and the quiet certainty that somewhere, sooner or later, another puzzle would present itself. She smiled faintly, pulling her knitting from her bag. After all, a puzzle is never wasted on one who knows how to read the stitches. Outro. And so the mystery of the Silver Locket slipped at last into the archives of St. Anselm's, a tale destined to be retold in the village for years. Embroidered with fresh details by each new tongue, the Whitcomb family resumed their lives beneath the ancient roof of the Hall, though the shadow of scandal had altered them. Lady Whitcomb carried herself with the same steel as before, but those who knew her well saw a gentler gravity in her gaze. Evelyn's compassion grew into strength, while Arthur, chastened by his own rashness, walked with quieter steps. For Miss Marple, the affair was another reminder that evil seldom hides in curses or objects but in the frailties of human nature. Greed, envy, and fear had conspired to turn silver into a weapon, and yet the locket itself remained only what it had always been: an ornament, a container, and a mirror of those who sought it. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple settled again among her roses and her teas, content to let gossip drift past like summer breezes. To her neighbors she seemed no different, a kindly old lady with a keen interest in wool and weather. Only she knew that behind each gentle smile lay a mind sharpened by long observation, ready to read the truth hidden between words and glances. The Silver Locket's enigma was solved, but mysteries, like seasons, never truly end. They simply wait, quiet, patient, inevitably, until Miss Marple once more happens to be in the right place at the right time.